Ava Val is a comedian, actor, writer, and musician based in Toronto. She's made multiple appearances at Just for Laughs and the Halifax Comedy Festival, and recorded stand-up sets for CBC Gem, Crave TV, and CTV. She has a weekly podcast of her own called PodGis, which is a great place to get a taste of her high-energy, clever, unique comedy. Val released her debut special, So Brave, earlier in the year. The special coincided with what Val called her 3-year hormoniversary, or the 3rd year she'd been taking hormones as part of an ongoing midlife crisis, in her words. That crisis is, of course, the joyful but uncertain journey of trying to align one's core gender identity with one's outward gender presentation. In this conversation, we talk about how the trans community, and more specifically transgender comedians, can equip themselves to contest and defy the hateful, ignorant transphobia that is surging alongside the rise of right populism. We also talk about why complimenting someone on their bravery can have some connotations that aren't particularly flattering, both for the flatterer and for the flattered, and the level of bravery that's actually required to stand on a stage and demand the attention of people who are there to laugh, but who also arrive, presumably with some openness to being changed, to, the kind of comedic storytelling that challenges them as much as it amuses them. Val and I discussed what it means in that moment of performance to balance entertaining a crowd with being true to your sense of self and aware of your own vulnerability. I really respect Val's radical honesty, which I told her the first time we spoke for the podcast. Now, with the special out, we were able to dig into the way she writes and structures the material, the relationship she has with the audience, and with comedy as a profession. I hope the conversation, like Val's special, offers an access point for people that may not know about how awesome and original contemporary comedy in Canada can be, and especially for people that don't yet have a sense of the ethics and politics of comedy that is deeply and deliciously queer. That's great. Lots of shows, and the big one in some sense is like the release of this special.
That's right.
People hour-long special, which people can watch on YouTube on 800 Pound Gorilla's channel. It's called So Brave. And near the beginning of the special, you say you're going through a midlife crisis. And this is sort of the framing for the whole special, that and the theme of bravery, which we'll definitely get to. And, I wondered if you had seen Taylor Tomlinson's Netflix special, Quarter Life Crisis.
I had not. I've seen clips of hers. I think she's fantastic, but I haven't watched the full special.
Yeah, she's so great. And that special astonishes me because literally, she releases it when she's 25 years old, right? She's very, very young. And she is quite honest about the fact that she is experiencing a quarter life crisis. And I think it's really interesting when a comedian comes out with their first big special and says, "Hey, everyone, I'm in crisis, but, it's okay, and here's why." Was part of the point with So Brave to kind of have fun with the idea of being in a state of flux with your identity?
It all feels so circumstantial to me because all of it was, stand-up has always been so precious to me. I've been doing it for 17 years. And it was, not to be cliche, it's always been a source of therapy where I could kind of go on stage to talk through what I'm dealing with at the time and to triumph over it with comedy and to get laughter and maybe not feel so alone. It all comes from a pretty selfish impulse to overcome. And so everything in the special, it was just built from this need to not feel so alone during this crisis in my life. And it was the best form of therapy I could find. I did see a therapist throughout, but there's a special kind of triumph in getting a room to laugh at something that I'm struggling with, because it is a triumph. It makes a laugh is a recognition of resonance or relatability. I've related this concept to somebody and I've helped them sort of connect to it on a human level, and it makes me feel less alone. So everything that stems from that, every consequence of that is purely circumstantial, and just it all comes from this need of mine to get over these things,
Yeah. I like that. Like I feel as though your comedy has become kind of more sharply political in certain ways over time. Like just the precision of language, right? And the punches that you're like landing. But I like the idea that that is sort of secondary to this
Mm,
other kind of more like this deeper human need, right? To be seen, to be loved. And I think like while your experience is maybe not a common one, right? We could say
mhm.
the experience of a crisis or like trying to take care of yourself, love yourself, that is super relatable. I think of a show like Sort of, Bilal Bag and Fab Filippo's show. Like that's entirely what that show is about. How we're all in
Mhm.
these transitions. And I wonder, like clearly you're thinking about relatability, and I wonder, I guess, if part of the point of making a joke and making the joke you make at the beginning about how silly it would be to come out on stage and like not talk about these things
Yeah, yeah,
was to sort of, lay the groundwork for getting really honest. And like the joke is specifically about slowly turning into a goat. And like
yeah,
you have this line about how like if your hands were slowly congealing into hooves, it would be weird to not like make reference to that fact.
yeah,
I just think that's a brilliant joke. And you're saying that the kind of knock-on effects are circumstantial or secondary, but the joke is designed like it's placed at the beginning. I'm thinking for a specific reason. And
mhm.
was it to create that space to kind of comfort where you could do the material that you needed to do?
Yeah, absolutely. You've nailed it. It's for a while there, I was hearing all kinds of rumors in the comedy community, like criticisms, basically that all I talked about was the trans thing, and of course it
Mm,
struck a nerve with me. It made me really insecure because I recognized that there was truth in that. I was going through this midlife crisis, and I was speaking very openly about it, and the material just overflows in abundance. And
mhm.
so part of it was sort of this uh, part response to that, part like addressing my own insecurity about it. But I really did find that it it kind of addresses the elephant in the room in a very fun, playful way, and
Yeah.
a very self-aware way as well. And that just eases into everything else beyond that. Like it's such a great opening
Hmm.
joke to calm everyone's nerves and to set the room and to like set the stage, set the table for everything that I'm about to do.
And then the goat, like clearly the goat is like, you. There's a callback very quickly after, right? Like I'm the motherfucking goat,
Yeah.
which is such a good riff. But the weird thing it made me think of, there's a play called The Goat by Edward Albee that's about a man falling in love with a goat,
Oh my
and
god.
he's genuinely in love with this goat. It's not
My
a joke.
god.
Yeah. So that anyway, that that might be just me projecting on the special, but the use of goat in particular, I thought was brilliant.
I wish
Um,
somebody would fall in love with this goat over here. You know, when's that going to happen to me? Why are
well,
goats
I
more
mean,
lucky than I am?
thousands of views on that video. I think you're on your way. So the other big concept, like I mentioned in So Brave, is this idea of bravery, what it means to be brave, who gets to call others brave,
Mm,
especially like how condescending it is to call other people brave and not consider the implications.
yeah.
But like, I wanted to ask about the jokes that are about when you don't necessarily feel brave, right? Like when you're getting online comments about your bones. That joke, I mean, the way that you use your voice in that joke to kind of fight back against this weird tendency to reduce you to like the most bare part of your anatomy.
Yeah.
When you're going to pick out a bra, right? I think it's one thing to call those online comments pathetic, as you do, or to like try and sympathize with a Licenza employee that doesn't quite know how to help out what you call a absolute unit of a woman. um, I just wonder, like, how do you figure out a way to laugh at these things, right? Like, and even to find something validating in these kinds of things, you know?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really insightful question. I think um there's a comedian's need to not accept a compliment and to not
Mm,
boast. I think there's also a Canadian element to that. Being Canadian, we don't like to brag. We like to be modest. And so when I'm called brave, I acknowledge that yes, absolutely, there's truth in that. It is brave to be out, to be openly trans, and
Hmm.
especially in on a public platform, on a stage, uh, to be publicly trans. I acknowledge that that is brave, but the comedian in me first needs to sort of mock it to disarm it a little bit,
Hmm.
and then that way I can subtly after that like imply through my stories that what I'm doing is difficult, and from that comes a lot of rich comedy, but still I think subtextually beneath all of it, like you can still acknowledge that what I'm going through takes a lot of perseverance and
Hmm.
courage. So yeah, I think it's a neat little magic trick that I'm doing. That's why I love the title "So Brave." I think there are layers. Like not only
Yeah.
I do mock it, I mock being called brave, and I poke fun at my allies, but I think the rest of the set is a real testament to how brave it is to be trans.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. There is real bravery in the special. I think like that should be said, right?
Thank you.
The title is a joke, but it's absolutely brave what you're doing. And particularly for me, like there's a joke where you use the fact that you're a quote work in progress to riff on the potency of testosterone for changing the body
Hmm.
and especially your voice, right?
Yeah.
You drop your register way down for the joke and it kills. But I wonder if it felt like risky or weird at all, given the fact that you are on this journey with feminizing your voice to do that thing of being like my car insurance, where you drop your voice so low.
I well, I think that's the thing. I've developed this like thick armor because
Mm,
especially in the early stages of transition, I didn't want to bother. I couldn't be bothered modifying my voice, not doing any vocal feminization training, and I still really struggle with it. Like
mm,
hearing myself is a labor, and it takes up a small bit of bandwidth in my brain just to like get over
mm,
listening to myself. But it's just it's a recurring theme with me that like these things that really bother me about myself, these things that I really struggle to accept and forgive of myself, I lean so hard into them on stage
mm,
because that's my way of confronting them face to face, as if I'm confronting a person and being like, you know what, you ain't shit. I see you. I see
mm,
what you're doing to me. And
mm,
at the very least, acknowledging these things gives you some of that power back. Modifying my voice
yeah.
and going deep like that is just another way of, uh, like the goat bit, just being like, I am who I am. I recognize
Hmm.
that I sound how I sound, and so why not play around with it? Conquer it by not being insecure about it, at least deliberately. Fake it till you make it kind of thing.
Totally, yeah. And like a person senses that through the entire special. I think you have so many jokes that like capture that, and the thing you just said, you ain't shit. That kind of attitude, that disposition, that posture, is one that takes work, right? Like
Mm.
that actual position of kind of armored bravery. And I don't like Jacqueline Novak's "Get on Your Knees," right, which is an hour-long special, kind of about blowjobs,
Oh my
is
god.
a good example of that. Like she gets to a point in that special where she's talking about how she's talking about her persona, right? And she says like, this your dick ain't shit attitude did not come out of nowhere, right?
Yeah.
It came through this kind of work. And I guess I wanted to ask about feminism in a sense, right? Like the you use the term feminism in the special. In particular, this joke about how you feel like you're a shitty feminist because you at a certain point appreciate being catcalled, right?
Yeah.
Um, so like there's this interesting thing you're doing in the special around feminism where you're saying like I feel as though without explicitly doing it, you're kind of like interrogating how feminism can be exclusionary, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And I am acknowledging that I am new to quote unquote the sisterhood. I'm sort of new to being the subject of feminism. So that's an acknowledgement that like maybe my perspective is still immature, where being validated as a woman
Mm,
in even the most problematic ways, it's still so new and refreshing to me. And I'm so used to the opposite. And I'm so used to all the vitriol and the transphobia and the exceptionalism that I'm not a woman, that
mm,
when it does happen in these unique, novel experiences, even if they are really problematic, from my perspective, they're refreshing because they're the first bit of acknowledgement of my femininity that I've received.
mm-hmm,
So that's also like a lot of the point of the bit is I'm new and I'm immature and I
mm-hmm,
recognize that and I'm working through it.
mm-hmm. And like I don't know, you're giving other people this opportunity to kind of vicariously work through it. I think that's super valuable. I mean, how often do we really think about the connection between gender presentation and sexuality? Like they're connected in this way that we never think about. Like it's just totally
Hmm.
normal, quote unquote normalized or habituated.
Right.
Um, but like the jokes in the special that are about a more kind of like queer ethos of kind of owning your sexuality are interesting too, because it's not like you're saying like this is the unassailable and right alternative to this other kind of very conservative, scared of sex kind of attitude. You're saying actually like some people are too aggressive in their allyship, and like they demand a particular sort of performance of gender and of sexuality.
It makes me think of I like drag has become so pop culture now, and
Hmm.
it's interesting that a lot of people who don't yet understand the nuance and the distinctions between drag and trans people or trans women specifically, um, they kind of transpose that drag culture onto all trans women. And
Right.
so it's kind of my pushback against people who all they know is RuPaul and then superimpose that on every trans woman that they meet. And
Mm-hmm.
it makes and I'm not, like I say in the special, I'm not sassy. I don't slay, I don't work. I'm a regular boring human being off stage. And so I don't appreciate that sort of projection onto me.
Right.
It
Yeah.
puts pressure on me to perform this extra queerness, this extra
Mm-hmm.
femininity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the relatability there is like palpable. Like there's a really smart joke in that part of the set where and I've heard you tell this joke, I think, in different ways. Maybe the joke about drag queens throwing shade at you.
Yeah,
I don't know if people still use that term, throwing shade. It's like an old term, but I don't hear it enough anymore.
I don't
Anyway,
hear it as much, but it still
good
counts.
one.
It's still there. Yeah,
Yeah, it's still there. And I think like with that joke, it's not just the punchline; it's the punch of the actual insults that they're using that really kills. Like
yeah,
I can't do it, like the bit that you do where you're impersonating a drag queen, uh, insulting you, and then insulting a child, right? Um, it's really so much about the act out in that joke, and I wondered how that joke has evolved over time, because I have seen you do it in different ways, and how you found the right way to sell it in a sense, and whether those act outs, hands on your hips, the whole deal, are mostly spontaneous or like highly rehearsed things.
Oh, wow. Another good question. That that bit, truthfully, I I kept asking around with drag queens to like help me. I'm not so into drag culture. I'm not like so I don't the
Hmm.
language sometimes is a little foreign to me and being read and the roasts
Hmm.
that the language that they use is not so second nature to me.
Hmm.
So writing the transcript of that joke on paper was always difficult, and I couldn't find the right sort of insults self-directed at me. I even took to Facebook once where I was like, hey, drag queens, roast me, let me hear your best roasts, like I need to draw some material, I need your help.
Hmm.
And I it just felt like I kept coming up short with the actual words. But then I started to and I really perform with my body and I think with my body, and you really see that on stage. I improvise a lot, and all of it comes from this presence. I'm just present on stage, and I think with my body. So a lot of times when maybe I lack a little bit of confidence in the words that I'm saying, I
Mm.
will turn up the act out. I'll turn up the
Mhm.
physicality just to really emphasize the joke. So I think that bit in particular is turned up because uh, I'm not sure if what I'm saying applies to the drag community. You know what I mean?
I get
There's a
where you're
bit of
going.
that,
Yeah.
but it's also I think I have fun up there, and just being big with my
Hmm.
body is part of the fun. And I think drag queens give off such a big energy, so why not uh, imitate it? You know, get
Yeah.
big with my hands, and
It.
I don't know.
I mean, the proof is in the laughter, and it's like there's the it kind of brings the house down, that joke. It does feel uniquely you because of how conscious you are of your body. I personally don't. I can't imagine you know how exhausting and energizing it must be to like turn up the physicality when it's already up pretty high. Um, I wonder, if you ever relate that physicality to the kind of presence of other comedians, like whether there are people that really captivate you from a performance standpoint in terms of how they own the stage.
Yeah, I would. I mean, just listing my influences that I was really into when I started out in stand up, you can totally see I really had a preference for like physical comedians like
Mm,
Eddie Izzard and Dane Cook. I was a huge fan of Dane Cook at the time
mm.
in high school. And
And
forgive
he has
me. All
definitely like
right.
a lead, he has like lead singer energy, right? Dane Cook.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and both of them are very improvisational, both of them are
Hmm.
very physical, both of them play characters on stage,
Hmm.
and that just sort of via osmosis, just via fandom,
Hmm.
was a huge influence when I was starting out. And like reaching even further back than that, this isn't stand up necessarily, but like growing up, I was a huge fan of Mr. Bean and Whose Line Is It Anyway? And that also required just so much physicality. So I
Hmm.
always really resonated with like a high energy, unpredictable, improvisational, kind of like a rock star, in your
Yeah.
face energy.
It makes for a more compelling show in some ways, and it's also like Jacqueline Novak talks in her special about how it also makes you kind of harder to pin down. Like she's like, I just want to kind of be a gray blur on stage so that you
Mm,
can't kind of own my physicality. It's not yours, it's mine, right?
yeah,
I'm too squirmy. um,
interesting. Oh, I like
yeah,
that.
and then you've got like Hannah Gatsby making a choice in Annette to just stand, right? Like
Hmm.
she talked on like Conan O'Brien's podcast about like literally taking a stand with that special and how unorthodox and strange and queer, in fact, in some ways it was to do that
Mm,
as a stand-up. I think it's like it's wild to me how we watch bodies in these erotic, highly gendered ways, but then deny it so much of the time. Like the Olympics are a perfect example.
yeah.
Beach volleyball, a pole vaulter hitting his penis on the bar and knocking it off. Like the fact that the Olympic Village is stocked with more condoms than anyone could ever need. Like these are all overtly kind of sexual things that we just sort of laugh off in a weird way
Mhm,
until something like the Algerian boxer Imani Khalif happens, and everything kind of stops. And it's
mhm,
clear at that moment that like there's something about transness that destabilizes, that makes people uncomfortable, and all this stuff. When you've been on stage recently, I know you posted a clip to Instagram talking about this story. How have you been talking about it and the transphobia of the right? And what how is comedy useful for dealing with something like that? You know.
yeah, I've been workshopping this bit of that's resulted from the whole boxing controversy,
Hmm.
and what I'm really trying to explore is the fundamental premise, the hypothesis that it's about trans issues now, and we're all arguing about the validity of trans people, whereas like this will only lead to conversations about gender conformity,
Hmm.
and we're seeing in real time a cis woman, her womanhood being questioned just because of how whether or not she conforms to standard femininity, standard
Hmm.
conventions of womanhood. And so that's why fundamentally, when we say like trans rights are women's rights, that's what we mean. Like when someone is being transvestigated, quote unquote, when somebody is being questioned and hounded for as if they're trans, when they're, what am I trying to say? When someone is being questioned as trans and they're a cis woman, this now becomes a question about gender conformity
Totally.
and the validity of cis women born and raised female uh, being butch. Like now we're sort of getting into that gray area, and that's
Hmm.
what I'm trying to explore in my. I'm trying to articulate it better than this, obviously, and I've got a lot of work to do because it is a complex topic. Like
Hmm.
trans issues are gender conformity issues, which include everybody, everyone.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I know. Yeah, and I think having terms like gender nonconforming, it's sort of like it creates a bigger tent in some ways. It's like a more expansive, capacious term. And the categories are clearly the problem. Like
Mm,
the insistence there are only two genders, as though that is somehow like self-evidently true, that there, like when it's said by someone on the religious right, for example, there are only two genders. It is entirely about trying to like insist upon this very rigid set of categories. And I like how in So Brave you're talking about how that's like a form of grooming. You draw the line at that accusation that trans people are groomers, and you
mm.
say like it's extremely dangerous. But then you start talking really seriously about how heteronormativity and cisnormativity are forms of grooming. Did you want to talk at all about like where that comes from personally, like in your own experience as like a person that grew up as a quote unquote broy dude?
Yeah. I it's really frustrating watching this hypocrisy unfold
Mm-hmm.
because especially when you're trans and you transition later in life, you really in retrospect you look back and see all the instances where you were sort of pressured to perform straight straight cishet in
Mm-hmm.
society. Like
Mm-hmm.
the bit addresses this, but growing up, I was a cute little boy, and the amount of comments that I would receive, just it was so normalized how many adults would come up to me and be like, "How many girlfriends do you have? Oh, I bet all the ladies have a big crush on you. You must get all the ladies. You're just a Casanova." And like, and that is so normalized that people don't even recognize it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That um, any kind of queer person, it's reading to kids that being gay is okay. It stands in contradiction to this normalized behavior that we all have, and that's why people are paying attention to it now because they think it's
Mm-hmm.
we're grooming people when like the reality is everyone is being groomed at all times. We are all being groomed in a normalized cishet society, and I don't know why that should be such a controversial
Mm-hmm.
take. If you just look around, if you just sort of pay attention to the way you talk to little boys and girls,
Mm-hmm.
putting a onesie on a baby that says like ladies man, you're like, this is an infant.
Boob guy.
Yeah, yeah, really.
Yeah.
It's so ingrained that we don't
Right.
even notice.
Sure. Yeah. And like this is part of what I love about your comedy is that it's subversive, but it's also kind and generous. Like it's saying like the horse girl joke is to me like boundary pushing. And I know like when you first started playing with doing the horse girl bit, it was kind of polarizing. Like you got a weird amount of backlash, didn't you, online
Yeah.
for this
Hmm.
video that you did kind of impersonating a horse girl. And yet in So Brave you kind of double down and you're doing it again and kind of even more like more with more impact. Why, how did you get to a point where you were like, this is worth keeping in the special? Because I'm guessing you were like playing with the order a lot. Like you felt like this was working presumably in clubs. But did it feel risky, I guess, to given the weird backlash you got, do that joke in the special?
It really did. I The first time I posted that joke, it was overrun. The comment section was overrun with people accusing me of like being a criminal sexual deviant and this skinwalker who, like, the amount of people who called me like a pervert who was doing this trans thing as a fetish, and I was
Mm.
fetishizing embodying a teenage girl, and like the
Yeah.
accusations were so ridiculous, but I still wanted to take a minute to be like, okay, is there something in my messaging that is conveying this to these people? Like,
Mm.
I know most of these people are insane and they have these biases that they're projecting onto me, and they have this terrible, awful prejudice against trans people that we're all sexual deviants that they're just projecting onto me. And I'll categorize those in a box. But is there something,
Mm.
maybe if I analyze how I'm articulating the setup, perhaps that maybe too too easily gives them that ammunition?
Mm.
And so I like really dug into that bit, and I stayed on it because I really believed in it, and I enjoy the voice. I think the voice is really funny.
Yeah.
And
And the
and
sucking through the teeth, the loud sucking in through the
yeah.
teeth. Yeah.
And I wanted to bring closer together, like, we like the trope of the awkward teen going through puberty is
Mm.
such a common comedy trope. Like,
Hmm.
Tina from Bob's Burgers is a
Mm.
delightful character. She's like
Yeah.
going through puberty, and she's got crushes on boys, and she's like navigating in a wholesome way her sexuality, and that's what I wanted to do with this bit. It wasn't at all deviant. I was just sort of trying to draw a parallel to an awkward pubescent phase.
Hmm.
And so it took some subtleties in like reshaping the setup to
Hmm.
be a little less harsh. I think I just needed to contextualize this idea of the second puberty a little bit better.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think like that's the key is like when you post this video on Instagram, there's no context for it. It's just
Mhm.
something you thought was funny and a voice you like doing, and like I thought was funny, right? But you don't have the luxury of an hour special to like build to it, right?
Mhm.
And I think like the awkward team phase, you've got your audience, right? At that
Mhm.
point, if people have been paying attention, they're here for it. I think, and yeah, I think it's similar with the last joke in the special, right? The closing bit about bike cops
Ah.
is another great example of like this work of trying to be subversive and generous to talk about what's validating and traumatizing about like the same exact experience.
Mhm.
Um, you admit that you have this penchant for cops in short shorts, which is itself pretty funny, right? Cops in
Yeah.
short shorts, pretty funny. But then you get to this scene where you act out like a hard nosed cop being disciplined. And I wondered about that use of genre, basically, right? That's the like a huge part of the act out. The joke is that it's a scene in which you are kind of you're the whole cop show, right? Like you are
Yeah.
the entirety of whatever cop show you want to imagine. Could you just kind of talk about the genesis of the joke?
Yeah, sure. I hope this isn't disappointing, but the origins of the joke, I was in Second City's conservatory program,
Mm.
and we were basically writing sketches for our big showcase at the end. And I'd always been a fan of that cop trope of the chief, like, reaming
Sure.
out the impetuous subordinate, and like the give me your badge thing. I just
Hmm.
love that dynamic so much.
Hmm.
And so the genesis of the idea was a sketch. I wanted to do a sketch where
For
it's a
sure.
bike cop, and the chief is reaming him out, and he's done all these terrible things on his bike.
Hmm.
And the sketch didn't end up making it into the show, but I was so hung up on this idea, and I was like, I love this premise, and I'm such a fan of that type of scene that that bit is like 10 years old, and I've learned to sort of evolve it and at least set it up, slide into it in a more personal way.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because as I'm going through these changes, I do recognize that there are things that I'm learning about myself that I'm not proud of. My
Right.
tastes in
Yeah.
men, perhaps. And yeah, so that felt like a really good vehicle for that. It just all kind of came together
Yeah.
really nicely.
I love that joke, and I think that and the Blackbeard thing where you actually like disappear behind the door and just
Yeah.
peek out. That's a great use of the stage, I think.
Mm.
Um,
And those
yeah.
two particular bits, I'm especially proud of the fact that like they're in effect one person sketches. I'm doing a
Mhm,
sketch on
mhm,
stage. It's less conversational stand up. It's less traditional. It's I'm manifesting different characters and like I'm happy that I get to perform in an art form that is so flexible that where there's a will, there's a way that you could figure out to turn a sketch, what would be like better on in a sketch form,
mhm,
into a one person show, you know?
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like there was a moment where it seemed like there was a lot more experimentation with the form of comedy than there is now, actually. Like for the most part, post COVID, it feels like we've gone to, specials being filmed as just like live events with multiple cameras,
Mhm.
But there was a lot more kind of messing around with the framework of it, which I appreciated, but like I appreciate the traditional as well.
Yeah.
Um,
You are a connoisseur, Scott.
I try to be, I know what I like anyway, and I think I talked about this with a comedy studies kind of academic back in the day. His name is Ivo Neuenhaus, and he and I both were like, we appreciate woke comedy. Like this whole idea of being of wokeness being a problem in comedy is obviously just a kind of like rehashing of the culture wars argument and stuff.
Hmm.
This got me thinking about your relationship to the crowd, right? Like the fact that on the one hand, you appreciate the love that you're getting from the crowd, but on the other, you kind of don't want to just be pigeonholed as the trailblazer trans comedian who's doing trans jokes. So like, there's a kind of interesting way in which you're walking a fine line to some extent.
This is the thing. I've seen enough queer stand up that
Mm,
I really appreciate that queer audiences want to celebrate queer acts.
yeah.
And um and sometimes, in my opinion, they are a bit too generous, a bit too
Mm,
forgiving, and I need them to challenge me, and I
mhm,
need them to not let me off the hook, and that is a desperate need I have to fulfill. So like every time I come after the audience or I come after allies, I am encouraging them to be tougher on me, to hold
mhm,
me to a higher standard. Don't let me get away with easy shit just because I'm part of a marginalized group. Like
mhm.
what I have to say needs to have value and needs to challenge you, and you need to challenge me in turn. If we're all going to grow, if we're going to get anywhere, if we're going to create quality comedy, there needs to be some tension here.
Politically, if you want, and I know like there's a bit in your special where you talk about sounding like Seinfeld at a certain
Yeah.
moment, and it's I won't spoil that one. That's so great. But Seinfeld is a guy who recently, and he's been moving toward this for a long time, has very explicitly come out against quote unquote woke comedy, right?
Hmm.
And believes, like the Chappelles, who we've talked last time we talked a lot about Chappelle. Let's not give him any more airtime. That there is a threat to comedy itself when it comes to wokeness. And what I kind of hear you saying to some extent is that if you're being too generous and not challenging the comedian on stage to be sharper, more creative, more insightful, then you're actually not building the resilience needed within, let's say, the queer community to fight folks like Seinfeld and Chappelle who
Yes.
believe that wokeness is kind of stupid and
Mhm.
toothless or something, right? So I feel like on some level rejecting clapter, what Seth Meyers calls clapter, um, is like building that sort of resilience, if that makes sense.
I love this point. Yes, absolutely. Finger snaps to that. Yeah, like
Okay.
you nailed it. I couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's really coming out of what you're talking about in terms of looking for a kind of therapy that is a therapy that comes from, you know, being seen by strangers, but also members of the community, like earning it, like actually, you know, earning that feeling of relatability.
Yeah. To build on what you were saying, like, don't give your critics ammunition. I mean, you shouldn't obviously care so much what they think, but at the same time, don't make it easy on them either. Don't be the example that they, yeah, exactly. Don't be the example that they point to where they're like, look, all they have to do is just point at themselves and be like, I'm so special, aren't I? And I'm so beautiful and I'm a perfect little angel butterfly. And everyone goes, yes, 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 you are. We can't be that easy. You know, we can't give them that ammunition. We have to be the ones who are like insightful and challenge each other.
Yeah. And then the joyfulness. Like, I think the joyfulness is like the ultimate weapon in some ways. It's just this kind of vital force. And you know, what I call generosity, it's the same idea, right? You're letting the crowd into, you know, it's not, there's no actual antagonism, right? Like it's I mean, yeah, it's a fantastic special. I think the joke about how the one audience member's zebra laugh will win you a Juno is such a great riff, because it is a weird laugh. Like, you have to identify the fact that there is this whooping laugh happening, but then it's also like a generous thing of saying, like, you know, it's not going to be my brilliance, it's that weird laugh that's going to win you a Juno, you know. The Juno thing is an interesting one when it comes to comedy in Canada. Like, it does actually seem like it's one of the things that matters too. Like, when we talked last time, it was a lot about how there just isn't a support system in Canada for comedians. You know, the labor union, that the relatively new labor union is a step in the right direction, but it's tough, right, to be a Canadian comedian and trying to break into like the US market and everything. So yeah, funny people, when they kind of when they reach their threshold for bullshit, are so important culturally, generally speaking. So great talking to you, and congrats on the special and everything that's going on.
Likewise, Scott, thank you so much for having me. I'm like, it's such a pleasure talking with you. You're like, you know your stuff, and your questions are always so insightful and challenging, and I think that's really important, and I appreciate it. Thank you for chatting with me.